Honore. He is the former commander of Joint Task Force Katrina, and he coordinated military relief efforts after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005. Lieutenant General, thank you so much for being here. I just want your reaction to President Biden's comments there, specifically when it comes to funding.
Funding is an issue. The president has identified $16 billion needed for FEMA to finish out the year and to take care of the people of Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, and the people in Maui. This should not be a contested event in the Congress. But as he alluded to, as we've seen in the news, there are people in the Congress who want to tie this to other funding, and that will complicate the thing. You know, about 18 years ago, I stood with President Bush and Governor Blanco in New Orleans, almost 18 years ago to the date. And both of them, while they disagreed, they showed great grace in the presence of the press. And I think the president was on target, thanking all the federal workers this Labor Day weekend. And the thousands of volunteers that are on the ground, Simone, from all over the country, who's actually doing most of the feeding there. Faith-based organization, Red Cross. We have 2 squadrons of the Louisiana Cajun Navy on the ground in that town where the president is serving food. So we have a lot to be thankful for, and I think the president highlighted that the federal government is there, and FEMA has gotten better and better at responding. And my hat's off to them from where we were 18 years ago.
Lieutenant General Honore, so what are the next steps here? A presidential visit, obviously very important, putting a spotlight on an issue that has gripped the nation. But for the people of Live Oak, Florida, nearly 60,000 people at this point, as we talk right now, are still without power. What are some of the next steps as they start to, before they can rebuild, they still have to dig through the debris?
Absolutely. Debris removal. The registration with insurance company, if they have insurance, a large part of that population don't have insurance because the cost of flood insurance is too high. But I say it a different way, it's too damn high and they can't afford it. And the money they give from FEMA will not cover the full repair and replace of their homes. Recovery is a living hell, Simone. I wish the Congress would do things to make it more cooperative for people who've lost their homes. But they're operating under the Stafford Act. It needs to be updated because if we're going to tell people we're going to make them whole, then we really need to do that. We know we got thousands of people from Hurricane Ian last year, and we've got, from 2 years ago, we got 1,200 people in Louisiana living in trailers from Hurricane Ida that still haven't resolved the issues with FEMA, recovery, and with insurance. So the recovery is a living hell. The hardest part of this for people is yet to come. And unfortunately, the poor people will get poor and the rich people will get richer because they'll buy up a lot of their land because the poor people and the elderly will not be able to rebuild with the amount of money they get from the government.
Lieutenant General, all right, my last question to you, and I want to go back to this question about, we were showing, and right now, folks, you're looking on your screen, I think you saw one of the president's vehicles just blocking the screen. President Biden is right now, he seems to be doing a rope line, speaking to folks out there in the community. Some of the other photos we've been showing, Lieutenant General Honore, have been of these floodwaters. Can you just address how dangerous these floodwaters are? I have seen some videos. Yes, we have them up on the screen. These floodwaters are dangerous. The water is, for lack of a better term, just not clean and, frankly, not safe.
Yeah, that's a good point. We would discourage anyone from operating in that flood water without going through a thorough cleaning afterwards. But, you know, these high tides that come in with these storms, because the storms are coming in stronger, the president alluded to the impact of climate change, that I think maybe for the first time we had a Category 2 storm cross Interstate 10 from the Gulf. I don't think that's ever happened before, then go through 2 other states as a Category 1. The storms are getting stronger, they're getting more frequent, and quite frankly, we don't have the manpower or the money in FEMA to deal with these repetitive disasters we're having in the country, and the Congress is going to have to address that because people need help. Over time, we've moved closer and closer to the ocean. And people are going to have to look out how they rebuild, and the president alluded to that, building back stronger and better. And that is the standard in Florida now. Most of these homes were built before Florida executed its hurricane preparedness home where they have to lift them off the ground. But most of these poor elderly people will have a hard time getting back into their homes, sadly to say, Simone.
And building above the floodplain. Lieutenant General Russell Honore, thank you very much for being with us this hour and breaking it down. I want to bring in some political professionals now. Basil Schmeichel is a Democratic strategist, and he is the former executive director of the New York Democratic Party. And Brendan Buck is here. He's an MSNBC political analyst and a former chief communications advisor for former Speaker Paul Ryan, among others. So, I actually want to start with where I kind of left off in my conversation with Lieutenant General Honore, and President Biden talked about this in his remarks, the FEMA funding. Brendan, there's been lots of talk in Congress about the disaster aid. On Thursday, President Biden asked for additional disaster aid. He was asked in that press conference if he was confident that the United States government will have the money. And he said, quote, he can't imagine the Congress saying that they don't want to help. So he is confident. Brendan, what is Congress going to do?
Yeah, it's sadly not uncommon to need to do a funding package like this for FEMA. We have natural disasters, and Congress regularly passes additional money to make sure that particular situations are handled. This one is going to be more complicated than usual. You have the issue of Ukraine. The president has also submitted a request for additional funding for Ukraine, and there's been thought that you could tie those things together. But that could get very politically difficult. You're going to have people in Florida who are saying, I don't want to be a part of that conversation. I don't want aid for the state of Florida to be tied up in something else. We also have the situation that federal government in its entirety runs out of money in 4 weeks. And they're going to need to pass some type of short-term funding bill. And this is often the kind of place where you would attach an emergency aid bill like that, make it hard for people to vote no. But here again, you're going to have a situation where conservatives are very angry that we're having to do that. So it's going to get messy really quick. I think this is going to work out. In my long time on the Hill, I never saw a situation where a FEMA funding bill didn't get done. But we've also not had as many complicating factors as we're about to see. I think it's going to get pretty ugly and pretty partisan. But at the end of the day, I think Florida and Hawaii and other places will get the money they need.
Basil, Brendan brings up a very good point. Pretty partisan. Today, it was notable that Governor Ron DeSantis, the chief executive of Florida, was not there with President Biden. I will note Rick Scott is there, who is running for re-election. He's on the ballot, Senator Rick Scott, in 2024. Do you think that Governor DeSantis missed an opportunity here? Is he putting his campaign over his responsibilities as the executive of the state?
Well, I think so, but I imagine he doesn't think that way. And, I talk about this frequently because living in New York City, for those that don't know, this relationship that we have with New Jersey and former Governor Chris Christie, 500,000 people go back and forth between New York and New Jersey across the Hudson every day. So the parties and the leaders have to work together. So in 2012, when Barack Obama gets off the helicopter and embraces Chris Christie after Superstorm Sandy, Chris Christie never lived that down. He didn't live it down in 2016. And in some ways, he's not able to live it down even as he's running for president right now. He wants to be a Republican that can win in a blue state. And frankly, I don't think that the Republican primary electorate wants that or cares about that. So if you have someone like Ron DeSantis, who and President Biden was gracious in saying, well, maybe he's got other things to do right now. But if there is politics involved in Ron DeSantis not being there today, it really does suggest that that where the party is, the political difficulty in him even reaching across the aisle to get help for people in his state. And to Brendan's earlier point, all of this is happening while we are in the midst of a conversation around a government shutdown, and the president is creating an impeachment war room within the White House. So you can imagine what else is occupying the minds of members of Congress, even as they may consider support for Florida.
The president also took time in that press conference to speak about Jacksonville, Florida. And he talked about silence is complicity. You must not, will not remain silent. He said he would have more comments on that in the coming days and weeks. Brendan, I played right after the horrific racist attack in Jacksonville happened. We went out to look for sound from a number of the Republican presidential candidates, and I could not find anyone talking about denouncing white supremacy. I saw a lot of people talking about scumbags and terrible people and mental health, but no one talking about what the FBI, no one who's running for president on the Republican side, what the FBI director has called the greatest domestic threat that we are facing, which is white supremacists in this country. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, disappointing, not surprising. I mean, we have had a party for a long time that where the elected officials are frankly afraid of a lot of voters. And, Donald Trump has set up a dynamic within the party where we completely ignore the middle. Yeah, anybody in the middle can be written off, and therefore you can't afford to lose anybody out on the far right. And that's why everybody, one of the reasons why they're unwilling to really cleave off some really unfortunate parts of the party. It's an electoral thing, and it's depressing to say that out loud, that's a way that a lot of people are thinking, but they're not going to risk alienating anybody who may potentially vote for them, even the ugliest type of voters.
Our hearts are with the people in Florida, everyone who was affected by what happened in Jacksonville, and especially Hurricane Idalia. Basil Smikle, Brendan Buck, thank you both very, very much.